Greetings, YouTubers. Welcome to the 27th series of Orality from the Logic of Sense. This series begins Deleuze's deep dive into psychoanalysis in a process he calls the dynamic genesis, which he distinguishes from the static genesis spoken of earlier, in that the static genesis begins with presupposed events, leads to a state of affairs, and then to the expression of those events in propositions. The dynamic genesis, on the other hand, starts in a state of affairs, leads to events, and then to the production of the surface. The state of affairs Deleuze starts with is the nursing infant. And then the dynamic genesis is concerned with how does the oral function of speech get separated from the oral function of eating? How does the incorporeal event of language get separated from the sounds of bodies in depth, the sounds that the infant naturally makes, before these sounds get separated into elements of language? And most of all, the dynamic genesis is concerned with the production of the surface, which is where language is made possible. Orality is a pun or a homonym in this series because this series is very much concerned with sound. And I'm just going to read a short passage to give you an idea of that. And then the first stage of the dynamic genesis appears. The depth is clamorous. Clappings, crackings, gnashings, cracklings, explosions, the shattered sounds of internal objects, and also the inarticulate howls, breaths of the body without organs, which respond to them. All of this forms a sonorous system, bearing witness to the oral anal voracity. Deleuze draws upon three main sources for his look at infant psychology, which are Sigmund Freud, Jaques Lacan, and Melanie Klein. And the latter two were very influenced by Freud, and their work could be seen as an extension of Freud's work. So he says that the history of depths begins with what is most terrifying, with the theater of terror best painted by Melanie Klein. And here he's going to go heavily into Melanie Klein's theories, which it's really helpful to have get a bit of a background on her theories. It can be very confusing otherwise, because he dives right in, expecting the reader to know what he's talking about. And I'll provide some links below to help with that. So Klein starts with the mother's breast. The infant divides the mother and the mother's breast into a good object and a bad object. And this bad object gets further splintered and fragmented into tiny pieces, which are toxic, poisonous, aggressive, alimentary, or excretory. So he brings in both of Freud's oral and anal aspects into these fragmented pieces, which get introjected into the infant or projected by the infant out onto the mother's body. So these fragmented partial objects that the baby either projects or introjects are representations of their mental and emotional experiences. They are not material objects. And therefore, Deleuze will refer to them as simulacra. And simulacra relates to how he views Plato's theory of the ideal form, where simulacra there are representations of these ideal forms. The word simulacra itself means to replace reality with a representation. So we can see that Deleuze does not regard these representations as reality, and this is he's using that in the context of the baby processing their experiences. Deleuze wrote quite a bit on simulacrum in his previous book, Difference and Repetition. You can study it more there. And then there's also a couple of essays in Logic of Sense. One of them is called, in the appendices, one of them is called Plato and the Simulacrum, and the second one is Lucretius and the Simulacrum. So I think there's a little clue here on how Deleuze is regarding Plato's philosophy vis-a-vis simulacra. What opposes these fragmented pieces of the bad object that gets introjected by the infant or projected is not the good object. What opposes it is what Deleuze calls the body without organs. So body without organs, body without objects, which in this series, Deleuze is going to equate with Freud's ego. And it's important to know that this body without organs, a concept he originally got from our toad, which we discussed earlier in an earlier series, that body without organs, he's going to change his definition of it as his work proceeds. In his next book, Anti-Oedipus, his first collaboration with Felix Guattari, the body without organs will take on different meanings, and it gets further elaborated in their next major book, which is 1,000 Plateaus. This entire system of introjection and projection is the communication of bodies in depth. So it's the system of the infant's mouth, the mother's breast, and the mother as a whole. This is the communication of bodies in depth. So Klein says that there's three what she calls positions that the infant goes through. The first one being the paranoid schizophrenic position. And what is schizophrenic about it is this tension between the id, which is the what would be called the depths of the body, or the instincts, that tension between the id and the ego. This is the paranoid schizophrenic aspect of it. The good object, which is the mother's breast when the infant is nursing, is also the lost object, because when she stops nursing, the good object goes away. Deleuze will relate the good object to Freud's superego, and he'll say that the orientation of the good object is from the heights. If you recall his three orientations of philosophy, of the heights, the depths, and the surface, and we can relate that here to the good object comes from the heights. Like, as far as the infant is concerned, it's unattainable in their psychology, and the depths is the id, or the instincts, and the surface will be the ego. And so this is the dynamic of these three gets played out in Klein's second position, which she calls the depressive position. The third position of Klein's is the sexuality position, and Deleuze gets into that in the next series, which is the series of sexuality. The depressive side, he says, or the manic depressive side, it's the tension between the ego's identification with the good object, with the superego on high, as opposed to its identification with the body in depths, with the id, with the instincts, and with the fragmented objects that are in the body in the depths. So the good object he calls the principle of the manic depressive position, and it also determines the manic depressive position. And one reason for that is because there's always a sense of frustration on the baby's part when the good object is withdrawn, when it gets lost again, goes back into the heights. But also, the good object is where the developing child first extracts a voice from the sounds of the bodies and depths. So the voice, the first sign of language, comes from the good object on high. And so this is obviously the parents speaking to the baby. And he'll say that it's not yet, it has the elements of language, like it has aspects of denotation, manifestation, and signification, but it is not yet language. It kind of presupposes a language as the child goes from noise to the voice, from the sounds in the depths to language. And it still lacks the event. It lacks the sense that's going to turn these pre-event sounds that are going to become language from the voice on high into language. It still has to get the event for that. He'll say that Freud acknowledged that the superego, the good object on high, has an acoustic origin. So again, we're back to orality as in sound. And also he says that there's a lot of evidence in dreams of someone going in between the noise of the bodies in depth and the voice, which will become language. So one might ask, what does this look at infant psychology and the dynamic genesis have to do with my life today? And there's a paragraph in this series that addresses that question, and this is it. The comments we will make about certain details of the Kleinian schema are intended to sketch out, quote, orientations, unquote, only. For the very theme of positions implies the idea of the orientations of psychic life and of cardinal points. It also implies the idea of the organization of this life in accordance with variable or shifting coordinates and dimensions, an entire geography and geometry of living dimensions. So I think he's saying that we can look at these orientations, the height, the surface, and the depths, or the superego, the ego, and the id, and how these dimensions interact and play out in our own psychology. Now, when I first came to this part of the book, and others have expressed the same, it all of a sudden got very confusing and mystifying because there was no clue. If you don't know anything of Klein's work, which I didn't, all this stuff sounds very abstruse and obscure. So there's a book called The Priority of Events by Sean Bowden, that the 5th chapter in it is called Psychoanalysis, and it's extremely helpful for distilling down Klein's theories and how Deleuze puts his own philosophy on top of her theories. And it's very useful to get a background in that before continuing on in the logic of sense. So for the esoteric side of this series 27, is the series of orality, and key 27 in the Kabbalah is related to the path of pay, which the English word for is mouth. So there's a direct relationship there. If one studies the correspondences of pay, one will see a lot of correlation with this dynamic genesis, with this starting out as from the very beginning and developing into something. Another esoteric side to this is that we can look at the dynamic genesis not from the point of view of a newborn infant, but from the point of view of the spiritual person who has died and is now being reborn. We found a couple of series ago in the series on Univocity the statement that the problem was to overcome our form or to break our syntactical link to a world. And that could be looked at as giving up the ego or trying to go beyond the ego. Now, there's a concept in Hermetic sciences called crossing the abyss, where one goes from, let's say, the world of representation, crosses the abyss, and then goes into the real world, quote unquote, real world. And the world of representation is also the world of illusion. And Deleuze, this might sound fanciful, but he actually has a sentence in this series that says, everything starts out in the abyss. So the abyss is directly mentioned, and that's another way to see it. And I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll meet next time in the next series on sexuality. Stay tuned.